Hi folks, a very good morning to you. I've headed this presentation, Challenges and Change, and the biggest challenge for me is I'm sitting here with a headset on, addressing an audience I can't see or hear from at the present moment, which is a novel and changed experience for me. There's an old saying that if you're watching an elephant water skiing, the question you want to ask is not how good is it, but just be impressed that it's doing it at all. So regard me as a water skiing elephant this morning as I go through this, because I'm a webinar virgin. What I want to do is to have a look at some of the big and I think fairly obvious challenges that are facing local government and the wider public service. And then I want to have a look at how we go about dealing with change within that context, because the external challenges are severe and will be severe over the next period, and it's a question about whether our own change management is up to the kind of challenges we face. So I'll do a bit about what's going on out there and the likely implications of that for us, and maybe take a break at that point so folk can raise any questions and make any points they want to, and then move on to, so how do we go about addressing change in that context. So if I begin with the completely obvious in one sense, as you look ahead, the best estimate you can presently make, and this will be clarified by the Chancellor's autumn statements at the end of the month, is we are probably looking at about 3% per annum in cash terms out of the Scottish budget as we run through to 2019-20. That would be the average across that period of time and the figures we've presently got. Clearly, the experience of past governments is if there's misery, they tend to want to get it in as early as possible, so it won't necessarily be phased 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%. You might get 5% up front, because clearly the UK Chancellor is going to want to run through to the next election with people more or less having forgotten about some of the things that happened early on in the Parliament, and you can track that pattern really right back to the 1990s, that if there's misery to be had, you get as much of it in early as is possible. So it will be interesting and worth monitoring as we get to the end of this month. What are the implications in Scotland? How big are the year one reductions to budget as we go forwards? That knowledge that our budgets will come down goes along with a couple of other trends that create genuine pressures for us. There's a trend around growing demand, a lot of that to do with demographic change and a changing dependency ratio across Scotland, increasing number of children and older people to the working age population. We also have quite a mobile population, so we have a number of council areas in Scotland that are growing quite rapidly, but we've got others that are, if you like, depopulating quite rapidly, and that in itself will create significant pressures for those councils, and I'll come back to some of that. Clearly it's not just the outside world that drives pressures on councils and public services, there are internal factors as well, and some of that's just about patterns of cost growth. There's relatively little we can do about. You'll all know that there's been an agreement about 1.5% this year and 1% next year for the council workforce. Clearly that drives up the cost of delivering any level of service. We've got auto-enrolment, so all of our staff now have to be enrolled for a pension in a way that wasn't true in the past, and we've got things like PPP schemes for schools and so on that are maturing, and we're getting to the point where the council has to fund the total cost of those. So there are internal factors in our systems that kind of drive up the cost of delivering service over time. A lot's been made about new technologies and disruptive technologies, and I guess the critical thing here is about public expectations, that are people getting used to do business with the private sector on a basis that will start to shape their expectations about how they should be able to do business with the public sector. And other win-win situations here, that if we could persuade more people to do their business with us online, we could save costs against the way we could do business with them. On the other hand, I think some of the strategies of change that the private sector use in the finance sector, which is to use sanctions and rewards to drive people account, or we will not charge you for having an account. Much harder, I think, to do that against the background of what the expectations we have, and in the whole we seem to adopt a principle that if someone wishes to carry on doing their business with us face-to-face, they should not in any sense be penalised for so doing. I think it makes it harder to get the mass movement online if you haven't got sanctions on the boards. The private sector used to get there. And finally, and trouble to many of you out there endlessly, there is the process of public service reform itself, and an increasing interest, I think, in how public services and communities interact with each other and organise around each other, and I'll come back to that again. So if you just take a view of the next 5 years, but certainly the demographics can be extended across the next 40, the disruptive technologies will have effects across the next 40 as well. We are facing some really big challenges externally, but some also big challenges internally. The core problem for councils in addressing this is they frankly control very little directly of their own income. Most of council income, on average, 80+% is coming directly from the Scottish Government. But at the present moment, the Scottish Government is very dependent on the UK Government. And what that means is, frankly, what Osborne decides in November will be the biggest factor shaping what happens to your council or services budgets from April 1st next year. What John Swinney decides in Scotland will be another major factor, but the amount of space you've got at local level to control your own destiny is actually quite limited. If you look at the European average, I put in brackets there, across Europe the average local government raises 50% of its own income locally. That gives it a fair amount of scope. If you go to its public and say, the money we're getting from national governments coming down, can we raise more here? If you're at the level of 80% of your income coming from your national government, if your national government cuts what they give you by 1%, you have to raise 4% of local tax to compensate for that. So there's a huge gearing effect in there. Probably more difficult for us, there has been a council tax raise now since 2007. The cumulative impact of that over time across all councils has been about 2.5 billion of income that we've forgone as a consequence of the council tax raise. So there are challenges if the government says if you raise the council tax locally, you'll penalise your grant. It frankly makes no sense to raise your council tax locally. So we are fairly boxed in Scotland in comparison to many other parts of Europe. And what that means is, if for example we need to cut for councils next year is 5%, that won't be something your local members have decided. You'll have the unpleasant task of looking what you do to accommodate 5%, but you won't have decided whether that 5% cut is necessary or not. So councils, though elected, and though accountable to their local communities, operate a fairly compressed space actually in terms of their financial capacity. So looking forward, there will be severe downward pressure on the current budget over the next 5 years. It's likely, I think, and this has been the past trajectory in Scotland, that education will be relatively protected, and I would expect the proportion of the budget going to social and personal care to grow over time. But given education plus care amounts to a very large proportion of the total budget of councils, if we can't make significant reductions in those areas, by implication, the pressure facing other services will be even greater. So the environmental services, the regulatory services, the corporate services of councils are likely to be squeezed. And indeed there may be a potential irony in there that precisely at the point in time when we need a robust and well-resourced corporate change capacity, we're actually cutting that because we're trying to protect other frontline services. Some of this will clearly be driven by UK and Scottish Government priorities, but of course your own local politicians will have priorities as well, things they want to see for the area, just to some extent there'll be the budget configures eventually to handle financial pressure. won't just reflect the UK national or Scottish national picture, it will also reflect your local members' priorities as well. I think the one bit of kind of really good news I can give you is from April 1st next year, there are new taxpayers in Scotland. We have to set a Scottish rate of income tax, and the Scottish Government could choose to set that above the UK levels of income tax at any point in time. So some of the cut to the Scottish budget coming down from Westminster could be offset by raising road tax in Scotland, presuming the population was up for that and wanted to see a different balance of tax and spend in Scotland that applies across the rest of the UK. The difficulty of the powers the government has from April 1st next year is if you want to raise income tax, you have to raise both the base rate and the upper rates by exactly the same proportion. You've no option as of next year to raise the upper rate but not raise the base rate. So in that sense it's quite a hard power to use, given the average taxpayer in Scotland is quite a low income basic rate taxpayer. That said, if we could raise income tax by a couple of percentage points, it would offset substantially the cuts coming down line from Westminster. So as there is, at least in principle, an anti-austerity majority in the Scottish Parliament, that's an option. From 2017, the UK Act that's just been passed, the Scotland Act, that was passed last week, that will allow us to raise different bands of income tax and different ways to raise the top rate but not raise the base rate. So there'll be more flexibility to offset downward pressures from 2017. Just a bit about population, which I hope come up on your screen. Population projections are available for various time bands, and as you can see, our working age population is kind of flatlining. Our 65 to 79 population rises quite steadily through to the mid-2030s, but the one that's likely to generate the biggest degree of pressure for us over the next 10 to 20 years is the rising number of people in the 80 plus category, that green line that should be on your screen. Just a number of points on that graph. As you can see, in any year or 2 years, no massive shift happens. If you project it though across 10 to 20 years, you begin to see that we are fundamentally changing as a society. And I think one of the challenges of change is not to try and handle it in 1 to 2 year blocks, that we do need to take a longer view about how we support older people in an older population as we go forward. Some of that will have quite long lead times. At the present moment, the housing infrastructure in Scotland is pretty poor from the point of view of housing an ageing population, because it was never built for an ageing population. We have a predominance of three-bedroom houses with relatively few bungalows, and they command a premium. So the kind of accommodation that would be good for a very elderly population is the kind of accommodation we are short of. Often the bedroom standards we build to would not allow you to look after a frail and vulnerable older person at home. You couldn't get a hoist into the bedroom and use it with them. So the danger is, because we haven't got the housing stock right, we end up with far more people in nursing homes and hospitals than we need to, because we simply haven't planned the infrastructure necessary for them. So in looking forward at an ageing population, this is not just something about health and social care. They will be the reactive end of that system. For every single public service, and particularly those who deal with infrastructure, how are we creating an infrastructure that will support an older, frailer population over time? And many of the issues that the disability movement has raised with this over the last 20 years will actually become a majority of the population's issues as we move forward. Are we getting the height of cairns right for people who are not stable in their feet? Have we got access and so on right? Have we got bedroom standards right? And so on. So in looking at that diagram, this is something that's a good news story in one sense. We are all going to live longer. What we need to do though is begin a process of change now that equips us with the infrastructure and the services we'll need for older people to live well in Scotland in the future. The sort of sting in the tail of all of this is, as it stands, there is a very intimate relationship between ageing and health and care costs for both men and for women. And therefore one of the issues we face, one of the challenges we face, is if we don't get the rest of what we do right, so that less need for care and health services for older people exists, because we've got the infrastructure better, they're exposed to less risk and so on. If you don't, more and more of the total Scottish budget would have to be deployed into health and care. So for that reason, a lot of the thinking across the last 5 years about how public service needs to change has been thinking about how do we create a context in which people can live well, a context that prevents risk, so we don't end up spending more and more money in reactive services because we didn't get it right for older people as we move through. So quite a challenging picture as we look ahead, but I'll maybe take a break there and let anybody raise any questions or points they want to. So I think David will unmute you, as he says, and people can just play in with any questions that you'd like to ask. Given these challenges, clearly a huge amount of thinking at local level and national level has gone on across the last few years, probably beginning in depth with the Christie Commission and a variety of thinking that's flowed out of that. But where that thinking has got is in one sense about how we meet these challenges, but it's also a lot about how does the public service itself need to change if we're to be able to meet the challenges. If you look at the overhead in front of you, I mean, in a way all of this has become cliche, I think, across the last 5 years, but it's not unimportant. When the Christie Commission went on and on and on about getting to an outcome focus, what they were really saying was the way the public service is structured in Scotland creates a real danger that people become entirely focused on the service they work for and lose sight of the fact that the point of that service is that people out there in communities have better lives and better opportunities. So the outcome focus was really, I think, about getting our heads on the point of education is the quality of life and opportunities that children will enjoy subsequently and so on. The point of care is an older person can live well within their community. So of course we need to get the service bit right, but we shouldn't lose sight of why we're doing it, and at the end of the day for public services the reason we're doing it is to improve the quality of life and outcomes for local communities. Within that it's been recognised that some of the ways we've operated in the past have resulted in patterns of outcome that are anything but equal. Life chances of different communities are remarkably variable in economic terms, and social terms, and health terms, and educational terms, and that to some extent these inequalities then drove patterns of demand that the people with the worst health outcomes were also highly likely to be those who made the greatest demands on the health service. That led to that third point then, that if some of our communities are quite predictably going to have poor outcomes if we don't do something about it, can we identify the things we can do to stop that? And that has been the whole strand of change that's been focused on prevention and early intervention. But that's linked, I think, to a second strand, that if we're focused on outcomes and not services, if we want to improve the educational opportunities for children from deprived backgrounds, to some extent we've also got to address the deprivation they live with, because we know that deprivation has a major impact on children's ability to get value out of education. So a kind of line of thought around public service integration says the moment you start to focus on outcomes, you recognise that no one service can deliver the outcome. A whole lot of factors will shape people those outcomes, and we need the whole range of services working together. There's an interesting study which I would name to you, published earlier on this year by Scotland, the Scottish Public Health Observatory, where they were looking to see what are the highest payoff interventions that would improve health and reduce health inequalities, and the conclusion they came to was it would be giving people access to secure living wage employment. That's the intervention that has the biggest single impact on the health, not just of the individuals who get secure living wage employment, but their families, but that also has payoff in terms of the likelihood their kids would do well in school and so on. So what they were really saying was, even if it's health you start off interested in, economic development, employability services and so on are probably as important in preventative health terms as anything the National Health Service itself is actually doing. And that would apply, I think, to quite a wide range of life outcomes at different ages and stages of life. The tendency to talk about services and outcomes is one we should avoid. People have outcomes, and services contribute to them. Services don't have outcomes, and services need to integrate and work together around people in place if we want to improve the outcomes. And I suppose the final strand of change was an observation that some of the ways in which we've run public services in the past seem to be about doing things to people rather than working with them. And if we want communities to have better patterns of outcomes and so on, the answer is we need to work with them and respect the resources and assets that they have, as well as simply kind of trying to do things to them through public services. And that kind of connection between working better with communities so we can work better for communities, particularly the most vulnerable, has I think been a key strand of thought across all public services across the last period. We have, and I will waste your time talking you through this, I think it's pretty self-evident, a statement of ambition that's signed off between national and local government about what we want to achieve here. And I think the crux bullet point here is the last one, that the point of public services is they deliver demonstrable improvements in people's lives. All of that has crystallised in a bit of legislation this year, the Community Empowerment Scotland Act, which I'm fairly sure Her Majesty has now graciously assented to, so it is law in Scotland. And it does a number of interesting things that, again, I think create challenges for us and suggest patterns of change for us as well. What the Act says is every single public authority in Scotland has a common duty. So every public authority, including government, a common duty to work together to improve outcomes and to reduce inequalities and outcomes. So what's being said is, as well as all the other duties you've got to run services and deliver services and fulfil functions, your overarching duty is to work together with the rest of the public sector to improve outcomes and reduce inequalities in the community you serve. As far as I'm aware, there has never been a duty to improve outcomes in law before in the UK. We've had a duty to run services, but we never had a duty for the services to be successful in improving outcomes. So what the law now says is we have to be able to demonstrate that the way we run our services is actually improving outcomes and reducing inequalities. That says community planning matters. The public services have to come together, but that, again, I emphasise, includes government as well as local government, the health service, police, etc. We need to come together. And what's suggested is each community planning partnership should have what's referred to as a local outcome improvement plan, an LOIP. And that should be a plan that says, here is how we intend to improve outcomes in general across this area of Scotland, across the next period. But it must include a specific section on how we intend to improve outcomes for the communities who presently have the poorest outcomes in our area. So general improvement, but quite specific planning for communities whose outcomes are currently poor. Again, I think proving the public services together about that is going to be challenging, but what the law now requires of us is we show we're doing that, and we actually show over time that that's paying off, that the outcomes of those vulnerable communities are getting better. There is a duty on all partners to make community planning work, and that means two things, which again I think are worth noting. The first is every partner must show that the local outcome improvement plan they've agreed to is then built into their own contract planning. So if you're a council, you don't just sign off a local outcome improvement plan with your partners and then not build it into your own contract plan. You need to show that your own contract plan has been looked at as a vehicle for delivering the local outcome improvement plan you've agreed, and equally all partners have a duty to contribute the resources necessary to deliver the local outcome improvement plan. The final major new duty in the Act is the duty to enable community participation, that has within it a duty to resource community participation. Now, I'm not entirely clear precisely what that means at the present moment. The Act is open to be passed and will be guidance, but I think what's important here is the bit where we say, well, we held meetings but no one came. If you have a duty to enable and resource community participation, you're probably going to have to do a lot more than that to allow communities to engage with decision-making that will affect their lives and their services over time. So what's implied here is a much more active disposition towards communities, a much more active commitment. And if some of those communities like the disabled community in the area, would need quite substantial resource support to be able to participate, the law now says you will put that support in place. So though we will face budget pressures of quite a severe sort, what the law's saying is what you don't do under those circumstances is close down to your communities. What you do under those circumstances is open up to your communities. That will be challenging. It's easy enough for me to see that as a kind of cliche in a webinar. Actually quite hard to do that at local level, and a lot of thinking about what that final duty means will be necessary. But we need also to build it into thinking about changes I'll come on to, because if we're saying the community is who we serve, the community needs to be allowed to participate in decision making, then how does the community fit into the change programs that many of you guys are designing and working with at the present moment? Have they fitted in at all, or are these things that have been done within the council without significant community engagement? There are some related measures in the Act that are worth noting. There is provision that communities have the right to make a participation request of public authorities. And what that means is they can bring issues and say, we're not happy with what you people are doing just now. We have improvement proposals, which might include us doing some of what you can do. And each public authority has a duty to engage with communities if we bring formal participation. In other words, you can't just ignore them, they will have to be treated seriously and so on. This is, I think, an important tool for third sector organisations as well. They've a perfect right to go to local public authorities and say, look, you're trying to do this, but you ain't doing it well. We can do it better, and we can show you we can do it better, so we now wish to engage with you around that. There are powers for communities to seek land or asset transfer from public authorities. So again, if a community thinks it could run a particular local community centre or community asset better than the council, they have a right to put forward plans for how they do that. What's interesting is the law indicates the default position would be agreeing to that. In other words, you've got a very good reason not to agree with such a position if it's forthcoming in communities. And finally, ministers can direct public authorities under the Act to promote or support particular forms of participation or participation more generally if they feel the public authorities in the area are not doing this sufficiently. So there is a ministerial fallback position within the Act. What the Act does, I think, I'll flip back to the main duties, is to take the reform agenda we've all talked about across the last 4 or 5 years and say, well, actually, if we were to begin to rethink the duties of public services, how would you do that? And the kind of 4 duties there, I think, are the best effort of the law to say, this is what everything post-Christie has meant. It has meant we will work together as public authorities. It has meant we will enable and resource-based participation, and it made you a very clear duty to improve outcomes and reduce inequalities in your area. So that, I think, for me, sets the challenges we face, the broad pattern of change we've decided upon in Scotland. And that, I think, I hope, could take us into some thinking about your roles as change managers, people involved in change programs, service redesign and so on, but also of us colleagues from the third sector playing in, how they can play in as partners to those kind of change challenges we face. Again, I think nothing I'm about to say will be new to you, but I think the scale of challenge we will face across the next 5 years means we will actually have to engage very hard with this rather than simply talk about it. I think there are challenges which are to do with time scales and horizons, that some of what we will need to do is very long-term, and we should begin long-term change now. The difficulty is getting long-term change started when we're under acute short-term pressure, and the temptation is to do simply those things that help us balance the budget next year. I give you a simple example. All of the evidence we've got says that one of the key roles the public sector has in Scotland is as a provider of secure living wage employment. It is unquestionably the major supplier in Scotland of secure living wage employment. And we know that households having secure living wage employment has a very significant impact on children's chances in education, on people's health and well-being, the likelihood they will end up emergency admitted to hospital and so on. But if you look at how we're shaping up for budget cuts just now, often what we're saying is, well, we can't really touch the statutory services, so we're going to have to look at the non-statutory. And if you look at the non-statutory, we're often then talking about facilities management, land management and maintenance, cleansing, etc. And there's a real issue in there that if we know that what we need is more secure living wage employment, are we about to do things that gets rid of quite a lot of the secure living wage employment we've presently got? That may help us balance the books across the next 2 years, but in all the evidence we've got, it will mean we will face massively higher demand and challenges into the future if these people lose the secure employment that gives their families and their household stability. So that issue of how do you address short-term pressures you haven't chosen. These are coming down line from Westminster via the Scottish Government. But how do we balance the short and the long term? A second factor, I think, goes with that, and many of you will have been engaged in this over the last period, that the whole framework for business casing around change programs and innovation begins, I think, to create a cultural bias. Anything that's changed for the future has to prove itself to the nth degree, and the status quo simply gets taken for granted. So we end up spending much of our life intensively business casing quite small changes, whereas massive budgets just trumped along year on year on year, unreflected upon and unchallenged. I have never seen the business case for the status quo. I keep on having to produce very detailed business cases for any change that could take place at all. So there is a bit here about looking at our methodologies for driving change. Are some of them actually getting in the way of change? Do we get far too into the minutiae? of business cases and so on. And is that just a cultural bias, really, that the status quo gets taken as read and anything else has to prove itself to the nth degree? What it does mean is we're often very slow in making changes. By the time you've been through the whole business casing bit, a year's gone by, 18 months gone by, and so on. We are going to have to up our pace, I think, across the next period. There's issues, I think, about the structure of the public service itself, the different patterns of accountability around local public services, and the complexity that creates for us if we then want to focus together on outcomes. So if you reflect in any of your own areas, in most parts of Scotland, with 3 or 4 exceptions, the boundaries of the council are not the same boundaries as the boundaries of the National Health Service in the area. Police Scotland and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service are now national services. So we've got people apparently sharing outcomes but operating on completely different scales and with completely different accountability patterns. The Health Service has a distinctive accountability back to ministers for delivering the statutory duties placed upon them as a health service. Councils have a direct accountability back to local elected members. So if you look at the core structure of public services in Scotland, it doesn't, if I'm honest, make a vast amount of sense. You would certainly not sit down and design it now into something that has evolved over quite long periods of time. But it does make it harder, I think, to get to a common focus on outcomes. What is interesting, I think, is what many partnerships are doing across Scotland to say, well, where does it matter we get together to common focused outcomes? And that's likely to be at quite a local level, below the level of the council, right down to local communities. And if we have communities we all know we need to work with better, then let's organise our integration around those communities rather than a higher level. But there are big challenges in that, and much of the structure we've got puts us apart, even though we're saying what we want to do is to pull together. There's an issue, I think, within councils, but between councils and partners, about capacity and focus. We have taken out a significant amount of corporate capacity in the last 5 years. Our change capacity has therefore diminished. Much of the change capacity we've got is tied up in individual services, departments and functions. And the trouble with that is it makes it harder to get all of that capacity galvanised behind 2 or 3 key corporate priorities. It's spread all over the place, often not at critical mass, and therefore there's a bit I think we need to think about in thinking about change management. If it is core to how councils will evolve in the future, and I think it is, I would see change management and all of the programme and project management capacity that goes with it as a key corporate capacity that frankly probably ought to be reporting directly to chief executives. If we spread a limited capacity thinly, we end up with not enough scaling to shift things. So there is a bit here about how we organise around change within councils and within health services, within government, which I'm not sure we have spread our change capacity very thinly. It's harder then to get to a small number of corporate priorities and partnership priorities and then focus the change resource behind them. The final thing, I think, is around interdependency. If I'm honest, one of the things that has probably given us the most anxiety about prevention is we're not really sure what all the factors that lead to positive or negative outcomes are, who can influence those factors, and who all we'd have to be working with if we wish to improve on certain outcomes. We certainly need to be working with the private sector and the third sector and the community sector because they have key levers that shape outcomes in people's lives. But there's a whole range of public organisations we might have to be working with as well. So one of the challenges of change, if we want to get more focused on outcomes, more focused on reducing inequality across the next period, is how interdependent that is and how we sort out roles and relationships in sensible ways that allow us to manufacture those interdependencies. Let me just illustrate those points, I think these are the genuine challenges of change management we face. I've just reviewed 51 shared services initiatives, partly because the issue of why have we made less progress than some people believe we should have made across the last 10 years in shared services. What's been going on? And one thing I'm very clear today, reviewing what happened, including the detailed business cases around this, is that if you have 3 to 4 councils and more or less a 5-year time horizon, this thing needs to get payback in 5 years, it's actually very hard to come up with a positive business case for anything. And in many cases, these things didn't proceed because there was, frankly, within those parameters, absolutely no case for them proceeding. So if you take explorations people have done, say, of payroll services, because people have legacy systems in place, there's an initial disruption and disinvestment cost. The payback period is quite long and quite low. So any council sitting looking at it is now would think this is not a good area in which to invest our limited change capacity. The business case isn't strong enough. It's at the margins. Equally, if you get 3 or 4 councils together looking at a shared service, one of the things that will typically be the case is one of them will be exceptionally strong in that service area, already very efficient. We found business cases where there were single councils whose efficiency level in payroll completely outperformed the market for outsourced services. And they tend to look at the data and think, well, why the hell would we want to get into bed with a bunch of bozos who are nobody as good as we are? And again, there's an interesting thought in that perfectly rationally, why would you join a partnership with people who are less competent at something than you presently are? So for that one council, there really isn't very much gain in doing this at all, so they will tend to peel off at that point in time, and gradually your potential partnership dissolves. What I would want to say, though, is if it's stopping 3 or 4 councils looking at quite small-scale functions in a 5-year horizon, and you started to say, are there certain things where if you took all 32 councils and with a 15 to 20-year time horizon, the business case is a lot stronger? The answer is yes, but the trouble is it's very hard for any council in Scotland to plan for more than 3 years, quite apart from 15 to 20 years. So you get this difficulty around time horizons where people's short-term individual interests get in the way of things that might be in the long-term collective interest. And there's interesting questions in that then about if we leave all of this voluntary on quite small scale, will anything ever happen? And my guess is probably not, because there will be quite a good case for not proceeding with something. Do we need, with government and other parts of the public sector, to say, actually, if we need to change some of the scale and structure of service delivery in Scotland, how would we do that, and can we leave that just to what individual agencies feel like, or does that have to be something that we agree more collectively and then we are all signed up to implementing? But the challenge is there that it's not, you can't make a business case long term for a whole range of things, shared road services, shared regulatory services and so on. Much harder to make it across 5 years. It's very hard to get a 5-year payback period on some of this. Given the current pressures we face, most people's interest is in something that pays off in 5 years or under, not something that pays off from year 10 onwards. But what that means is we're always permanently sacrificing the future to work our way through the present. If I take the example of prevention, again I think it raises a question for us about understanding and the analysis that underpins change programmes. As a number of you will be aware, Finance Committee in Parliament is holding another inquiry into preventative spending in Scotland, whether we've shifted to prevention. If you look at it, what is prevention? It's identifying where predictably negative outcomes are likely to happen and then taking some action that either mitigates or avoids that happening. But what that means is you have to understand the levers of intervention, the causes that are shaping this, and so on. What I concluded looking at the evidence is much of what's preventative we don't talk about that way. Most of your councils have use cases and benefits clauses in procurements. Most people see procurement as nothing to do with prevention. Use and benefit clauses are often saying we want job opportunities created through this procurement for the most disadvantaged people in our area. Literacy and numeracy work in primary school is about preventing children being excluded from future economic and educational opportunities. Winter road maintenance is almost exclusively about prevention. We're out there gritting the roads at midnight to 4 in the morning, precisely so people don't smash themselves up or get into chaos the following morning. Utterly preventative. All of our waste management systems were evolved precisely to stop what happens if you don't have good waste management systems, which we have patterns of disease and so on that wiped out large parts of our population in the past. Planning and regulation is about how to design the places in which people will live, to design out many of the risks they might otherwise face in life. It's preventative. So I think, again, if we're trying to design change programs, too often we go, we've got to shift to prevention, let's think up a project. No, prevention is about stats. A primary school can be more or less preventative depending on how it's run and how it thinks about what it's doing. We'll still account for it as a primary school, but it can be doing more or less with its local community, more or less with the parents of vulnerable children, and more or less with the vulnerable children themselves. So it's not about new resources or different resources, it's about how do we use the resources on the ground. I think too many of our change programs end up focused on a new service or project, not enough on how do we get people to think differently about what they do already. And the big changes we probably need to make around prevention are how people think about what they're doing to maximise its impact rather than otherwise. I'm going to skip this next slide and just go straight to the end. If you pull together what I've said, I think there are issues about how we design change and how we design change programs. Far too often, if you look at the double-headed arrows in the first bullet point, we seem to start off with projects and then gradually evolve programs and then think, why are we doing that, and so on. It would be more helpful, I think, in corporate than we were thinking. Actually, what is the overall pattern of change we need to achieve across the next 10 years? What's the strategy for doing that? What programs does that mean we need, and how does that get just into project? I think we are still too much at the program and project level without that being connected to any coherent strategy for change at the whole authority level. I think that fits a second thing which change managers need to be more honest and explicit about, that often we set up structures for change programs that look as if we consciously designed them to fail. That we have underpowered change managers trying to take on deeply embedded silos within their own organisation without the empowerment and authority to do that. If we really mean the scale of change we will have to accomplish across the next 5 years, I think we have to rethink that. If you look at the private sector, their most highly paid staff are not the director level of staff in the bureaucracy, they are their change programme managers, because they are the ones who bring home bacon for the organisation. I don't think we've yet got to that insight. So we're asking people at tier 4 or 5 in our organisations to challenge people at tiers 1 and 2. It doesn't work well. One possible way of dealing with that is to have all change managers and change programme managers reporting directly to chief executives, so that people know that if they tangle with you, they're tangling with the authority of the chief executive of the organisation. We need to resource change properly, and I think we should use investment models to do that. If your change programme really matters, we should be able to predict cost benefits, and that will give us, if you like, the case for why we proceed with this change. But if you're only going to get the benefits and you beat the costs, I think far too often we try and do change on the cheap, and the result is we don't get the benefits either. So a more coherent investment model that says doing this now pays off in 5 to 10 years' time, it pays off in the following days, so it's worth the following investment, is the way we should go. And I think the final challenge in change is how do you connect with all of your change management colleagues, change programme colleagues across government, the health service, locally, police, fire, etc. How do we manage the interdependencies we've got? How do we get to a more true partnership around change? How do we allow that other people are co-producers of change with us? I think still too often we prefer to have agents rather than partners and co-producers, because that gives us a sense of control, even if it's not all that helpful in fact. And I think particularly our engagement with voluntary community organisations often means we don't get the best out of them as change co-producers, because we don't give them the empowerment and space. We want them as contractors who do what we tell them rather than otherwise. I think the juncture we're at creates massive opportunity for change. We cannot simply carry on. We're running out of resources to support that. But I think what that does mean is we need to think really quite hard about our own approach to change and change management, really quite hard about how you put change programs together and how you design change programs. And particularly, I think we need to think about empowering those who are saying are responsible for driving change within our organisations. If they end up depowered in comparison to those who wish to protect the status quo, it's very hard to get the change we want to happen. With that, we'd be glad to know. I will shut up and happily take any questions just now. Bring up some with it, however, when there is remembrance moment, but I'll happily respond to any questions that you go through the system.
Okay, so thanks very much to Colin for taking the time to present us today. We've got just one question in from Gary Todd from the Community Planning Partnership. In order to increase the scale of addressing complex inequalities and outcomes, what else does the Scottish Government need to do? For example, acute investor investment is focused on meeting specific acute sector performance targets, whereas if this aligns directing resources to achieve acute targets was relaxed, then NHS boards could redirect resources from acute to community and primary care.
It's a fair point, and any government will face the challenge that you want to prevent future demand, but you're stuck with the current pattern of demand you've got. And politically, I think people being turned away from hospitals is probably the most singularly damaging thing. What I would say, though, is the assumption is we're talking about health budgets and we're talking about prevention here, and I do wonder whether that's wholly right. I think one of the discussions we'll have to have over the next game around change is a known as one with communities. I was at a meeting where people from my community were saying older people are very low and isolated because of cuts to care. And I kind of said, well, but that's a really weird version of a community, isn't it? That the answer to loneliness and isolation of older people is a professional care worker paid for by the public sector. Aren't these people your neighbours? Why are they lonely and isolated? Do you never speak to them? It seems very odd that we've come to the conclusion the answer to loneliness are care workers. So there may be a bit, I think, that we need a much franker discussion with communities about what they should expect from us, but also to some extent what they should expect from themselves. And I don't ultimately think with an ageing population the answer to all the social inclusion and well-being dimensions for older people can conceivably be done through the public service. So you are right, we're in a vicious circle just now. Money ends up tied up in acute precisely because patterns of demand exist. But I also think the question is, do we resolve all of that? Or back to that final point, I mean, it's dependency here. Are there other people who are far better placed to do things that will, if you like, be prevented in this context than simply assuming it's the health service? I think the second point you're right, though, is if we protect the health budget by cutting the care budget, that is an act of insanity. It makes absolutely no sense at all. It will simply need the health service to be, the hospital sector to be progressively more under pressure. I think even the Chancellor down south has recognised that. There would be very little sense to hatchet the care budget to protect hospitals. So I suspect what we'll see progressively is a kind of ring fencing around the whole health and care budget, not the hospital bit in isolation from the rest.
Okay, so that's us just coming up to 11 o'clock, so we'll just finish up there. The slides and the recording from today will be made available on the Change Managers Network, and I'll send you details on how to access these in a follow-up email. If you have any questions about the webinar, then please either contact myself or contact Colin. There's had a couple more questions that we haven't been had time to answer.
If people put their email addresses or their telephone numbers, I'll catch up with them subsequently.
Okay, that's fantastic. So thank you for your attendance today, and I look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Thank you.
Bye.